Good morning and welcome to Namibia Media Holdings Annual Budget Review, brought to you in partnership with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Namibia, Standard Bank Namibia, as well as Liberty Life Namibia. The first word belongs to our special guest, our guest of honor, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Mr. Ipumbu Shiimi. Stay tuned and share your thoughts on Budget 2021.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here. Well, I, at the risk of repeating myself and maybe just give you a picture of what I have already painted in the budget statement, it's important to understand the context under which the budget was prepared. We all know that we are in the middle of the pandemic, but looking back 3 years back, we know our economy has experienced some difficulties. We had, in 2016, the commodity super cycle came to an end. Then we had successive droughts, but we also had government withdrawing from many other years of an aggressive expenditure ramp up. So all these forces combined created a very difficult conditions for the economy, and COVID actually just added salt to injury. So. And with COVID, it's not only the Namibian economy, it's a pandemic which is global. As we know that the global economy contracted by about 3.5% last year. And that's also then fed into the economic situation at home. So as a result, the Namibian economy contracted by about 7.3%, which is a very deep decline. It's not something that I have seen in my professional life. So that's the economic situation now with output and the economy contracting. It also means that revenue was negatively affected. We have seen for the current financial year, which is ending in few days' time, end of this month, revenue contracted from about 58 billion to about 55 billion. So it was quite a significant decline. And going forward, revenue is still expected to decline. although other sources of revenue are expected to either remain flat or pick up a little bit. The biggest decline comes from SACCU. For the next financial year, SACCU is expected to decline by about 7.5 billion, which was a big shock for us when we first got that figure. We knew SACCU was going to decline, but it looks like the effect of COVID on SACCU has been very severe, because SACCU is basically constituting two main components: the customs component, which is the biggest component, and much of it is coming from sin taxes, sale on alcohol, sale on tobacco, and we know for a larger part of the year last year, especially in South Africa, those activities were significantly constrained. There was a ban on alcohol, there was a ban on tobacco. As a result, not much revenue went into the pool, and as a result, we expect a significant decline in SACCU. Other revenue sources, of course, as I said, with poor economic activities, those revenue sources have also been constrained, and therefore they either remain flat for the next few years or picking up slightly, but we don't expect them to reach the levels that we have seen in 2019, 2020. That's the context, and as a result, we have to try and see how do we balance our books. Obviously, with revenue down, it means expenditure has to be reduced, but of course, much of the expenditure is fixed. It's salaries that you have to pay. There's not really much that you can do about it over a short period of time. It's social grants that have to be paid. There's not really much you can do about it that has to be paid. So we try to cut on a number of items where we can cut. For instance, freezing positions. We have the directive we have given to all the OMAs is really only to fill the most critical positions, and many of them have actually complied. We looked at things like goods and services. Where can we make some savings? Things like travel, which was already cut to the bone. We try to even trim it further. Of course, reducing government expenditure has also short-term impact on the economy, because government is a big spender in the economy, so we are cognizant of that. But when you don't have fiscal space, that's probably the only choice you have to make, because the budget have to be funded. And if you cannot fund the gap between revenue and expenditure, and the gap between revenue and expenditure is already high during this fiscal year. Fortunately, we are still able to fund it, but funding it means that debt is accumulating, debt is increasing. And therefore, the only way to slow down the accumulation of debt is actually to reduce the gap between revenue and expenditure. That's why we try to keep to reduce expenditure. Of course, some other expenditure items that were in the budget of 2020, 2021, such as the stimulus packages, those ones are no longer relevant for the next financial year, so those ones have been taken out. But the gap still remains significant, even though we have tried significantly to cut expenditure. So going forward, the situation remains more or less the same. We'll continue to cut expenditure where we can, especially in the area of having a long-term plan on salaries and wages. As people retire, some of those positions will not be filled, and so that we can get the benefit of natural attrition. And of course, the reform on public enterprises is going to continue, so that we can generate some savings from the amount of money that we put into public enterprises. We have seen that we had to take a difficult decision to close Namibia. It was not an easy decision, but it's done in the context of really trying to strengthen the government finances in the long term, because we have been putting a lot of money into the airline. Unfortunately, we have not managed to keep the airline profitable, even minimize the loss that the airline was making. So as a result, we had to close it down. It's unfortunate, because it meant that employees were negatively affected. Government went out of its way to try and help them for at least a year. So although it's of course not the best thing that can happen, but at least something extraordinary that government has done. It's not something that has been done before. So where do we focus as for the next 3 years? The focus should really be on how do we get the economy to recover again. So we are already seeing some green shoots in the economy. For this year, if the projections that we have at the moment hold, we expect the economy to at least grow in the region of about 2%. Of course, that hinges on the stability of the global economy with the vaccination program in the US, in Europe, in other parts of the country, of the world, being rolled out. So that gives us hope that there will be some stability in the next couple of months. But of course, there are significant risks there. The vaccination programs are being delayed. There's a scramble for vaccines. All of us want the vaccines at the same time, but the manufacturers cannot cope up with the production or the demand, and therefore the rollout of the vaccine may be delayed a little bit of time. A little bit, and that's why that can cause a bit of it may change the forecast on the global economy, and it may change our focus on domestic growth. But we are cautiously optimistic that this year is definitely going to be much better than last year. So the focus will be on growth. Now that the global economy is stabilizing, how do we reform our economy in such a way that, first of all, the existing industries that have potential to grow can grow? So that needs coordination. And a government's role is really to make that coordination more effective and provide the missing ingredients that will have to come from government. Not necessarily money, but coordination, and of course the provision of basic goods, things like roads, rail. That's the job of government. So those are usually the missing ingredients that are needed to support economic growth. But the emphasis is that this growth has to be led by the private sector. Private sector should take advantage of these opportunities. Government needs to provide the necessary condition to nurture the private sector growth, both domestic and foreign direct investors. The fact that we have now rolled out the HPP2, which is spelling out government commitments in terms of where will be the government focus. The government focus is going to be, for instance, rolling out the PPP framework, and the idea is really to try and lock in the private sector investment. Government will come in there to provide the necessary infrastructure, but the private sector should actually run with it. So we are now looking at and how do we aggressively roll out our PPP framework, because we now have the law. We now need to put that law to work. We also need to, as government, to concentrate on things like water, for instance. How do we make sure that the coastal region has got enough water for the mining sector? Because with commodity prices picking up, we expect the mining sector also to pick up in the next couple of years, and therefore one of the missing the missing ingredient is actually water, especially in the coastal area, and therefore looking at how do we partner with the private sector with a new desalination plan. The existing desalination plan, which is there, is a way of partnering up with the existing desalination plan. That's the second part. The other part, of course, we are a logistic hub. How do we make sure that we get our Trans-Namib up and running again? How do we get them locomotives so that they are able to provide that service? How do we maintain the railway line so that we can continue to provide that service to the hinterland that are surrounding Namibia, countries like Zambia, Zimbabwe, and of course leverage the port infrastructure that we have. We have expanded the capacity of the port. We now have to put that asset to productive use, and also we also need to focus on new areas apart from those existing areas, those existing engines of growth. Where can we move into to try and diversify the economy? Because we have to diversify the economy. We have to produce more goods and services that are more sophisticated, because countries can only progress when they actually produce sophisticated goods that can be sold to the rest of the world. That's the assignment that we are busy with. In a couple of months or so, we will come back to Namibia, and again the private sector, to say, this is what we are saying, what do you say? So what do you see, so that we can have that dialogue and that conversation, and eventually we'll probably come up with something as a country that we believe that it's something that we need to look at. One specific area I want to mention is, because we are getting a lot of inquiries from a number of big companies in the world, is the area of green energy, or green and blue, blue ocean. So one specific issue there is looking at how do we use the sun resources and the water resources that we have. It looks like the energy for the future is no longer not only solar energy, but it looks like it's hydrogen. And we seem to have perfect conditions for the production of hydrogen. The fact that we can produce, we have solar energy. With that solar energy and wind energy can be used to separate hydrogen from the water. We have seawater, and that hydrogen will be the fuel of the future. Cars and buses, planes. In the future, I understand it will run on hydrogen. It will no longer run on fossil oil. And I think that's a new area that we really have to exploit, and so that we transform our economy to something that is going to give us more resources, more revenues, and create employment opportunities. So again, all these things, we will have to do it together with the private sector. Government's role, as I said, is not really to continue pumping in money into these big investment projects, but really to create that conducive environment for the private sector to play their role. So that's more or less the context, and that's more or less what the budget is really trying to point out in terms of the reforms that have to be taken, to be undertaken, and also in terms of the area of focus in terms of promoting new investment opportunities in the economy. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. Honourable Minister, we are used to seeing education and health as the top votes year on year. So it was quite surprising this year that finance actually came in second. Now, you did speak in your budget speech about PwC, the medical aid fund for government employees. That gets a usual big chunk. And you also said that money for vaccines against COVID-19 will be ring-fenced within PwC's budget. Can you explain exactly how that will work? And also, what are the other big expenses of the Ministry of Finance this time around?
Well, yeah, that's a good question that you're asking, Danny, because when I motivate for the budget, my colleagues always think that, oh, you're giving yourself a lot of money while you're actually cutting our budget. But the Minister of Finance budget is actually everybody's budget. As you have already talked about SEMAS, usually SEMAS, like the current financial year, actually going to spend around about 3 billion on SEMAS, something which we think is too excessive, and we believe that we have to undertake certain measures to try and reduce that. So for the next financial year, we are packing SEMAS at about 2.6 billion. But we also have about 500 days, I think it's 484, something like that, million, that is earmarked for the vaccine, which is also in the SEMAS budget. So SEMAS is kept more or less the same, slightly higher because of the vaccine. The part that is going to the SEMAS itself, it's reduced. We're hoping that the measures that we are going to undertake are going to reduce SEMAS. And therefore the other part is actually for the vaccine. The other big component is actually interest payment. So we're spending in the region of about around 8 billion on interest payment, up from 7.7 billion, and that's about 14% of our revenue. That is increasing, and the reason why it's increasing is because debt has been increasing for the past, let's say, 7 years or so. And as a result, that debt has to be serviced. You service the debt by, of course, paying back the debt, but also there's a cost of having debt because you have to pay interest, and therefore a biggest component of actually, or one of the biggest components of our budget is actually interest payment.
Now that brings us to debt. I think there's a lot of concern not only among economists and people in the know, but also the man on the street. We're looking at a ratio of 70.4%, I think, of GDP at the moment. And by 2025, you estimate almost 85% if you round it. What is government going to do to prevent this from getting out of control? And what are we going to do beyond 2025 to actually get out of debt?
Yeah. I think that's also a good question, and of course we agree with those that are expressing concerns about debt. We have expressed concern about debt. If you recall, over the last 5 years or so, government started with a very aggressive consolidation program. And the reason for actually reducing expenditure was actually to try and reduce the gap between revenue and expenditure. Because debt is actually created, as I was saying earlier, debt is created by the deficit. If you have a deficit, debt will continue to increase. You will only stop to accumulate debt in absolute terms, and I'll talk about it in absolute terms. Of course, as a percentage of GDP, if your GDP is growing faster than your debt, that ratio can also come down. But in absolute terms, if I add 3 billion to my debt stock, because that's what I have borrowed, that was my deficit for that particular year, debt will increase. Obviously, if the GDP is growing faster than that, as a ratio to GDP, that can come down. And therefore, the strategy is really this way. First of all, try to trim down your expenditure in such a way that you're really only spending on things that you need to spend on. So expenditure has to be trimmed, and that's what we have been trying to do. Over the past 5 years, government was very, very, very aggressive, to the fact that it actually had temporary negative effect on the economy. Because when government is withdrawing, and government is a significant player in the economy, it accounts for about 22, 21% of GDP. When this big thing withdraws, it means the economy is also going to shrink. We all complain about that, but those are probably necessary reforms that we have to undertake to be able to create a long-term sustainability for the country. So that's one. Let's reduce expenditure. We tried to reduce expenditure, and again, I gave an example to Namibia. It's actually a way of trying to reduce part of our expenditure so that we can contain the deficit. The second part is to grow the economy, because when you grow the economy, it means you are generating more tax. You're generating more tax revenue, and also you are also the denominator is also increasing. So first of all, you're closing the gap between revenue and expenditure, and secondly, the denominator that you're using, the scale that you use to measure your debt is also increasing, and therefore debt as a percentage of GDP will come down. So ultimately, that's really what we have to do, and as I said, the next 3 years or so, we need to focus on that. Grow the economy, reduce the expenditure where we can, and therefore that will help us to stabilize our debt.
Minister, you want to raise a lot of capital locally inside Namibia, and is this really going to be that easy? Is the private sector ready to put that money up? And I mean, if you don't get that money, what is government going to do? Will it maybe force more investments locally as opposed to foreign investment?
Yeah, we actually have a combination. If you look at our gross funding requirement for the next financial year, is about 29 billion. So more than half of that is actually coming from sources than raising money from the domestic sources. So what are those sources? We're looking at the savings that we already had. Of course, you know that we had put some money aside over the past few years to redeem our Eurobond. In other words, pay back the Eurobond that is maturing this year in October. Part of that money we used last year, or in the current financial year, for the fiscal stimulus that we have provided. The emergency income grant, the support to the employees that are losing their jobs, the support to the employers that are to keep employing people. All that money came from there. We are still left with a bit of savings that is going to be used to fund part of our financing requirement this year. So that's one source. The other source, you may have heard that we have received support from the African Development Bank. So there is already an existing program that is running where the African Development Bank is supporting us for our agricultural programs. But we have also received COVID funding. You may have picked it up in the media 2 days ago. Yeah, 2 days ago, that our COVID application from the ADB or the African Development Bank was actually approved. So that's another source. So you may also know that we have also applied to the International Monetary Fund for the COVID support, because they have also, with the advent of COVID, they have also introduced a program that's specifically targeting COVID, because all countries have actually been affected by COVID, and most countries actually on this continent have actually already benefited. So we are waiting for our application to be processed. We understand that it will go to the board in the next couple of days. So we are positive that we're also going to get support from the IMF. So those are all foreign sources that are complementing the domestic sources. So we're not only tapping into the domestic source because for two reasons. One, there is also a limit as to how much you can tap from the domestic source. And secondly, you also want to leave some capital available for the private sector because, as I said before, the private sector has to lead the growth. And with economic activities picking up, you expect private sector to start borrowing. And when they start to borrowing, we don't want to compete with the private sector on resources because that's the capital that is available to the whole economy. It's not only available to government, it's also available to the private sector. You want the private sector to also have their own share. So that's why we are actually combining these sources.
Minister, let's move on to tax and revenue issues. I think that's interesting to the public also in your speech. They wait for that bit to see are they going to pay more or less taxes.
Yeah.
And you had an interesting list, and at the end you said implementation will only be in the next financial year. Are there any of these tax plans you may actually implement earlier, or can some of it be backdated?
Well, the idea with tax is always you want to give people enough time to get their houses in order. So you don't want to surprise them that, I'm going to tax you tomorrow because you need to rearrange your finances. So that's why we have given that 1 year notice, so that people prepare themselves, and government should also prepare themselves. So that's why. So we don't expect to actually change our mind in terms of the implementation date. In my statement, I have also made mention of the fact that one of the taxes that we have announced is already on the statute book. Is already a tax that has been there. It's just the enforcement was very, very poor. That's the tax on foreign freight service providers. So if you come here with a flight from outside, you are a foreign owner of a plane, pick up cargo here, you're actually supposed to pay some tax, but that tax has not been enforced. Equally, if you have a vessel, a foreign vessel, and you pick up cargo here, you're actually supposed to pay some tax. We have not enforced that. So that's the only tax we are saying. It's already there, it's a question of enforcement. The rest will then be implemented, the new taxes will be implemented in the next financial year.
You have indicated that SACU revenue did drop dramatically. It's about a third or 35% down. And there's also pressure on other sources of revenue. According to budget documents, you also expect less taxes from companies, that's non-mining companies. What is government going to do to make sure that you don't run into the fix where this continues? How will you start to get the tax income growing again?
Well, the tax income can only grow when the economy is growing, because the base of collecting revenue is actually the economy. When the economy is growing, it means more resources are being generated. And therefore, our emphasis is really we need to be aggressive as a country to ensure that with the stability that we see on the horizon in the global economy, we need to take advantage of that stability. Reform aggressively, attract investments, both domestic and foreign, and target those specific investment activities that we think will make a difference here and where we think we can be successful as a country, using the know-how that we already have, and also learning new know-how to really increase domestic economic activities. That way we'll increase the tax base. That way we'll get more revenue. That's really the strategy at the moment. Apart from the fact that, as I said before, reducing expenditure, but some of the expenditures we have already cut it to the bone. There's not really much you can cut further without compromising the provision of services. So the emphasis is growing the economy.
Thank you very much, Minister. We wish you all the best with a very difficult task.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All of us are in all this together. I'm encouraged by the support that we are seeing from all the Namibians. We all want to make a difference, and therefore our call is let's all work together so that we can make Namibia a better place.
That was our Minister of Finance, Mr. Ipumbu Shiimi. Stay tuned for some expert opinions from our partners. We welcome now Monique Klute, Managing Director, Liberty Life Namibia. Welcome to the program. Now, the Minister of Finance proposed in the budget that the tax threshold on pension fund contributions, they are considering lifting from 40,000, that's an annual amount, to 150,000. What do you think will be the impact on your industry?
Thank you, Danny. So, the economics teaches us that higher levels of savings will boost productivity over the long term, and obviously levels of investment as well. And in order to have that money in the financial system, it will enhance the growth in the economy, as the minister's just mentioned. He said we've got to grow the economy to increase, obviously, tax revenue. In Namibia, we are not necessarily a nation of savers. We definitely see the scales tipping in favor of short-term consumption versus long-term investments. That's something that we note in the market. And the bulk of our savings is legislated at the moment. The introduction of this relief means that individuals who choose lower levels of contributions now, as a result of the effect of the taxes on their contributions, may now save additionally and not be taxed twice on those contributions. So I think it'll definitely enhance a better savings culture. And I know that there are obviously views saying, but does it really talk to poverty reduction? Because it's your higher income earners who will be saving that additional money. But if you take it conservatively and you say, look, about 1% of the population will use the additional 110,000 now offered, and they'll only use 10% of it. You've got an additional 200 million in the system on an annual basis. And that money goes into education policies, it goes into retirement fund and retirement annuities and pension funds. And for those products, you retain 45% of that, you retain in Namibia, and there's a portion that goes into unlisted investments as well. So the multiplier effect of having that money in the economy is a lot larger than the poverty reduction that we'll see.
COVID-19 has hit very hard. One way of saving was to save on pension fund contributions, in other words, paying less for your pension, and a lot of businesses actually closed, so pension funds had the problem that in that case these funds were liquidated, so you lost that income. How are you managing this, and how long do you think it'll take before we see a recovery?
So it's a tough one, Donnie. You've got COVID hit really hard. Obviously some industries more than others. Employers tried to reduce contributions to save jobs, and other employers didn't make it. And essentially it was funds that were liquidated, or participation in umbrella funds was liquidated. So for people who've lost employment, there is an opportunity to continue saving, but it's not easy. I understand that their survival needs. People need to continue to live. And this money is, in a lot of cases, what they have available for now. But we've got to look very critically at how those liquidated funds are being utilized by the individuals who've received them, because it's taken years to build that money up, and it can be destroyed. The value can be destroyed very, very quickly. From an employer point of view, in a lot of instances, the savings from employees in funds is the only savings that the employee has. About 70% of employees only save in their pension funds. And I mean, it's startling, but we've got to provide the opportunities for people to grow those nest eggs. In my mind, the future of pension funds is a lot more about the member than this almost cookie cutter type approach that we've been using for the last little while. Since introduction. So it's more about being flexible. Employers have got to start being flexible about the benefits that they offer, the contribution levels, the investments, and so forth. Because every fund is made up of a member. And Donnie, between the two of us, our needs are very different. And I need to be able to cater for my own needs, even within my pension fund. And I really think employers need to think about it very hard. In terms of when we'll see a recovery, that's a tough question to answer, because we've got to see the economy growing more in order to stimulate this type of pension fund investment as well.
For most of us, it's really a hard knock life at the moment. Now, looking at maybe your clients or just the man on the street a year ago, March 2020, do you think a year on there is some light in the tunnel, and are we maybe in certain instances better off than a year ago?
Donnie, I think COVID has been tough on us, but COVID has taught us a heck of a lot in the last year. And I think where we're struggling is the change management of saying, this is what COVID has actually made available to me, and this is how I'm going to use it, and use it to impact me as an individual. The minister was quite open about managing revenue versus expenses, and it's a pretty simple formula that each and every one of us needs to actually use. So the formula for each of us as an individual, as organizations, as government, is an easy one. Income less expenses equals profit, or available assets. It's a simple formula that we've got to learn to manage. And government does it every year. They show us through the budget speech what they're planning to do in terms of managing that formula. For an organization, as I sit here as the MD of Liberty, that's what I do on an annual basis, is I need to manage income and expenses and monthly and daily. And I do that as an individual in my private life too. And the only way that I can manage positive profit is I've got to reduce expenses. That's the first place we go when we're struggling financially. We reduce expenses, but there's another element to the formula. You've got to increase revenue, or you've got to do them both at the same time. And that's really how people are going to have to manage their finances. We've got to start looking at, I remember somebody saying to me one day, you can't cut your way into glory. You can only cut so much. There are expenses you need to have. We need to eat, we need to be clothed, etc. So we've got to start looking at the other side of the formula and say, how do we increase revenue, and how do we do that through the opportunities that COVID has actually provided for us? So I think there are a lot of new opportunities that have come forward in the last year, but we've not yet managed to make use of those opportunities for our benefit.
Thank you very much for your insights. That was Monique Klute, MD, Liberty Life Namibia. Stay tuned. We'll be back with you after a short break. With us is Mr. Titus Ndove. He's Standard Bank Namibia's Head of Public Sector and Marketing Intelligence. Mr. Ndove, we are going back to the budget. We are experiencing extremely challenging times. What is the impact of debt on public finances?
Morning, Danny, and thank you so much for having me. And morning, viewers out there. It's definitely challenging times for public finances, and we can imagine that it's actually formulated under very difficult economic growth. In fact, the economy actually grew, or rather contracted deeply last year by about 7.2%. And the revenue, of course, is driven greatly from the economic performance. If you can see the revenue, total revenue for last year actually contracted by 6.1% if you're comparing the budgets of this year versus last year. And as a percent of GDP, you have revenue basically falling significantly from around 30s, where it has actually been hovering actually for the past for the past years. And in the next 3 years, which is basically the current period, it will be around 27%. That's a significant impact basically to government finances. And therefore, it makes government planning very, very difficult. And also then you look at the expenditure, it's very encouraging and a very good thing. For instance, if you look where the expenditure was last year, which was 41.2% to GDP, we really have to thank and basically praise the minister who was here earlier, that he managed basically to reduce that one to around 36.8% in the current financial year. That's a significant change, and we're basically really looking forward for that basically to continue, for fiscal sustainability basically to take effect. So debt is the elephant in the room, as we know, currently around 62.6%, and it's expected basically to peak to around 77.3% in 2023-2024. So it's a difficult time really for government, and we're really looking forward that new measures and reform will actually bring some significant changes, which will bring actual fiscal sustainability in line with what we expect, and so basically tame the debt dynamics, as we're going to actually talk more about as we go on.
Our income from the SACU pool is elapsing. What is your take on revenue and tax issues? And how can we start replacing the revenue we won't be getting from SACU anymore?
Yeah, that's a challenging one for really to diversify our funding sources. But we have seen, or rather we have observed, that government has actually introduced new measures through the Harambee Prosperity Plan version 2, which is proposing new initiatives, which is expected to diversify the engines of new growth. So that's key. Whether it will, how soon that will actually take effect, that's a question of another day. But currently, SACU really suffered a great deal. If you compare year to year, it was a decline of around 33%. If you're comparing what we received last year of 22 billion versus 14 billion we actually got during this financial year. So it's really a big hit to public finances. And to make things worse, South Africa, as we know, South African economy has actually contracted by around 7.3% last year. And the consumption was not actually made easier as well. Minister earlier referred to sin tax, which is basically consumption. There was lockdown, so people could not consume as normal, and that really impacted significantly SACU revenue, where generally we used to derive around 35% of the total revenue, but going forward we can see that number is actually even going below 30%. So therefore it's very important and significant for government really to diversify funding sources, which will really make its life easier for government itself and for the citizen.
Earlier in the program, the Minister of Finance said, and I think he said it many times already, that government cannot continue to be the main driver of growth and development. That has to come from the private sector. But let's just talk about the development budget of this year, because government do also play a role to kickstart the economy. Do you think it's budgeted enough in terms of development?
Looking at the current, or rather in the current situation in which we are, so there's nothing enough. So development budget is a total percentage of the expenditure is 9%. And the percent of GDP is around 3%. That is actually not sufficient because we know development budget is actually the foundation for infrastructure development, which is basically the engine for growth. So only spending around 3% of GDP and the convention, usually for middle income countries, they're supposed to spend around 10%. So you can really see where we are. So we have to do something basically to increase that, but we know fiscal space is constrained, so that's why maybe we are talking about private sector-led growth going forward to come in some way basically to ensure that spending, especially in infrastructure, is maintained and is increased for us to maintain the level of growth we are seeking. But at the current level, Danny, I don't think it's sufficient.
What do you think is important to keep fiscal sustainability going? There are worries that we are maybe heading for a situation we cannot manage anymore.
Yeah. So fiscal sustainability at the moment is challenging, and the key element there is actually the high level of debt. 68% and is expected to peak to 77% of GDP. That's very, very high. At the same time as well, we have debt service increasing from 14% to around 17%. So meaning that 17% of our total revenue is actually going to service debt. But the key thing, really, as the minister was, I think, explained it as well earlier. So the key thing is really the moving together of expenditure and revenue. The gap right now is around, is close to almost, I think, 5, 6, 7%. That's actually higher, but it's better than where we were previously. Another interesting and very concerning, thing, or rather element there to consider, is the growth in debt. The growth in debt and the growth actually in GDP. So GDP at the moment is actually growing lower, almost by 9 percentage points when you're comparing to debt. Meaning that the debt, by all means, for it to be sustainable, it should either, its growth, real growth, should actually be closer to the level of growth in debt, or debt has to slow down. So that's a key for fiscal sustainability, and without actually having those two big elements growing together, it's actually going to be very, very challenging going forward. But we also know that currently we are running a primarily balance, which is negative. And for you basically to tame debt, that one has to be positive. And yeah, we trust going forward, given the current measures and initiative introduced by the minister in the budget, I think we'll get them, but they're very, very concerning.
Finally, in terms of not only the budget, but also Chapter 2 of the Harambee Prosperity Plan, a lot is expected, not only of foreign investors, but also private investors within Namibia. Is the time right for that to start happening? And are circumstances really conducive enough for it?
A very important question, Danny. Whether the time is right for private sector to lead growth. The big yes, the big answer to that is a yes. So it's a right time for private sector basically to lead growth. And there's some studies as well done around the world, and one in particular I'm referring to is the Boston Consulting Group. Already in 2007, they realized that government resources across the continent is actually constrained, and therefore it's time for the private sector to play that significant role. Generally, on the African continent, about 2/3 of infrastructure development is actually financed by public sector. So, but of course now that time will actually not be able, or those levels rather, to be basically to maintain them going forward. So the answer to your question is yes, the right time for private sector, but what needs to happen then for the private sector basically to take that critical role? As we all are aware, private sector are actually profit driven. So in the project presented, there are projects of course in Harambee Prosperity Plan which are there. The key thing is the classification of those projects. Basically looking at the ones which have revenue streams actually guaranteed. And this way, maybe that's what you have to give to private sector. But some of the critical projects, like rails, etc., so unfortunately, government have to lead on that. And also important is the enabling environment, which you talk about. The government spoke about reforms. That means table those reforms, SOEs, regulatory reforms. Those are very, very critical for the private sector, basically, to take that lead. But the only critical question maybe we have to ask is, can the private sector alone do it? Or they need maybe government to basically kickstart by creating what you call a positive wave. If you create a positive wave, then say in the ocean, somebody has to create that wave. And that wave, when it's created, then you have fish following you. You have maybe dolphins also swimming with you nicely. But there have to be somebody creating that wave for everything to happen. And that seed has to be planted by government.
That was really a wonderful way of putting it, Titus. We need positive waves. We've been facing COVID-19 waves, and we need waves of growth now to get back on track. That was Mr. Titus Ndowe. He's Standard Bank Namibia's Head of Public Sector and Marketing Intelligence. Now, our Minister of Finance had the first word. Stay tuned, PwC will have the last word.
Good morning to our live viewers. On my end, as introduced, I'm Chantel Hesselman, co-party to this Budget Dissect, country senior partner PwC, as well as the tax leader. It is my honor to round up this morning's program on the continuation of what has been a series of events for the past week already on dissecting the 2021-2022 budget. We did start this morning's proceedings by having Honourable Minister Shiimi with us. And without reading from the speech, we could take from Honourable Minister's address to us this morning the budget as tabled and themed, boosting resilience and recovery, where again reiteration were made of the importance of the balancing act between having sufficient inflow of tax revenue as well as having a combined operational and development budget speaking to the current needs of Namibia and Namibians. On a positive note, Honourable Minister also did allude to the importance of the role between the public and the private sector, specific mention to the rollout of the PPP framework, which would also pave the way for much needed development projects and, as mentioned this morning, opportunities that we have in Namibia on blue and energy projects, as well as the need supporting the mining industry with desalination plant, and also just promoting Namibia as the transport hub in which we have the potential, especially with our road coverage and the expanded port in Walvis Bay. So on that note, Honourable Minister, I step in as part of our online viewers at this moment, and we thank you for the candid conversation, the insight shared, and we do look forward to continue that conversation. Moving along with our program, I also wish to thank contributions from Ms. Monique Klute from Liberty Life Namibia, as well as Mr. Titus Ndove from Standard Bank Namibia. Thank you for your prepared content share with us, the insight shared as well, and being available for the candid questions as posed to you. And we also look forward to continue the conversation with Liberty and Standard Bank on Namibia's road to recovery and being a resilient nation. As sponsoring parties, I wish to thank the NMH team under leadership of MD Mr. Albi Botha, Mr. Johan Nel and Jacques van Zyl, my right and left hands as the PwC team, and just the entire crew from all sponsoring parties. Thank you very much for another successful year of dissecting the Namibian budget. Then I would like to thank, most important, our online viewers. And discussions like these to me is not the end to the conversation, but in fact it is the start to more informed conversations where we can make informed suggestions and ask the relevant questions, and bringing us all pulling in the same direction and on the same page as well. So that is the challenge I put out to our viewers. We have promises made in the speech where further information would be shared on certain elements in the budget as read in the mid-year budget speech. So from now till milestones like October and important calendar events, we have the duty on us to continue the informed discussions and collaboration. Also, if you have missed the initial budget dissect on the evening of last week, Wednesday, our full presentation with a lot of prepared content for your perusal is still available on the PwC website. You're more than welcome to download a copy, and that is also an act of joining this important conversation. I would now like to leave you. If we were at our usual gala event, I would have addressed you. So to the ladies and gentlemen in my virtual audience this lovely Friday morning, I leave you with an inspirational quote, if I may borrow from Honourable Minister's speech, open quote, "Wakanda should serve as an inspiration, not only to the youth, but to all of us, for Namibia and the Africa continent to become a Wakanda." I thank you, and may we all have a blessed weekend.